Hey guys, today we are going to read more Sweetie, and we didn't really have a intro because it was something else I could not show you. So guys, let's just get into it. Chapter 5. "What are you talking about, Sammy?" asked my cousin Ducky. "He's in the circus, and he'll be here in 2 weeks." David's eyes sparkled. "His circus is doing a show in the city, and he's staying with us for 3 whole days. 3 whole days. 3 whole day. Wait, what? 3 whole days." Sammy looked over at Charles, eyebrows raised. Charles knew that meant Sammy thought this was another of David's wild stories. "The circus, huh?" Sammy asked. "What is he, an acrobat or something?" "A lion tamer." David shook his head. Ducky's a juggler." "Really?" David shook his head. "Ducky's a juggler." "Really?" asked Charles. He had always wanted to learn to juggle. His dad could juggle 3 oranges. He made it look easy, but when Charles tried, he always dropped the oranges. So that day, rolled all over the kitchen floor and got mushy, which didn't make Mom too happy. Dad had tried to teach Charles, but so far Charles just didn't get it. "That's cool." "I know," said David. "Ducky is cool. You should see what he can do. Once I saw him juggle 7 golf balls, or sometimes he juggles whatever is near him, like a hammer, a coffee mug, and a pillow, and he can palm a baseball, basketball in each hand, and do magic tricks, and eat fire." Charles noticed that Sammy's eyebrows shot up like higher each time. David said something. "David," Charles couldn't wait to hear more. "He's amazing." David finished. "And he's really nice too. He loves animals and they love him. Even Slinky will sit in his lap to get petted." "Do you really think he would adopt Sweetie? A circus would be perfect place for her." Charles could just picture Sweetie in the spotlight in the middle of a 3-ring circus, under a colorful tent. She would wear a shiny crown and maybe a sparkly costume, and she would jump through hoops, do tricks, maybe even ride bareback on a horse. Smart little Sweetie could probably learn to do anything, and the audience would clap and cheer and throw flowers to the newest star. Charles patted his knee up. "Sweetie. Up, Sweetie." The tiny dog ran over and jumped onto his lap. "What do you think?" he asked her. "Want to join the circus?" Sweetie looked at him with bright, shiny eyes. "Whatever you're asking, the answer is yes, yes, yes." She wriggled and squirmed and nibbled on Charles' chin. Charles giggled. "I think that's a yes." Sammy rolled his eyes. Whatever, he grabbed the booja and the blat. "How about some base booja?" Charles could tell that Sammy wanted to change the subject. He obviously did not believe that David had a cousin who was in the circus, and he did not like it when David got all the attention with one of his wild stories. I have an even better idea. David jumped up onto the weight bench and began to inch along it like a tightrope walker, holding his arms out for balance. Let's play circus. Charles glanced at Sammy. Sammy was frowning, and Charles knew why. Sammy liked to be the one who had great ideas. But circus sounded like a blast. Okay, said Charles. I get to be the animal trainer. Come on, Salami. It'll be fun. I'm a juggler and an acrobat. David jumped down on the weight bench. And I'm the ringmaster. Sammy finally gave in. That means I do all the announcing, plus I'll be in all the acts. He held up a pretend microphone to his mouth. Ladies and gentle worms, he shouted, presenting for the first time anywhere, Sweetie, the world's most talented puppy. He turned to Sweetie. Give her a big hand, folks. David and Charles clapped and whooped. Then Charles gave a hula hoop that was leaning against the treadmill. He held it up in front of Sweetie, and now, for the first trick, Sweetie will jump through this hoop. Almost before he had finished the sentence, Sweetie leapt right through the hoop. For a second, all three boys were speechless. Whoa, Sammy said. Finally, that was awesome. Let's do it again, Charles said. Up the hoop, Sweetie jumped through it as if she'd been doing it every day of her life. Now let's have her land on my back. David dropped to his hands and knees in front of the hula hoop. Up, Sweetie, he said. Wait, said Charles. He wasn't sure that was such a good idea. But before he could stop, her Sweetie sailed from her spot on the floor right through the hoop, landing perfectly on David's back. Charles and Sammy burst into cheers and applause. Sweetie stood there with her head cocked. Thank you, thank you. Then she jumped off David's back and ran back to Charles. He scooped her up in his arms. You're amazing, Sweetie. He gave her a big kiss. That was so cool. David jumped to his feet. I can't believe she did that. Sammy shook his head. David and Sammy clustered around Charles, reaching out to pat Sweetie. Think she can do it again? Sammy stepped back and pretended to peek onto the microphone. Once more, watch the stupendous Sweetie jump through the hoop of flames. David ran back to his position and kneeled on the floor. Charles put Sweetie down and held up the hoop. Up, Sweetie! Dave called David, and she did it again. Maybe Sweetie really was the most talented puppy in the world. For the rest of the afternoon, the boys tried every trick they could think of. Then they did somersaults while Sweetie jumped over them. They stood in a line, front to back, with their legs apart, and Sweetie ran through the tunnel they made. They taught her to sit up pretty on her hind legs, and Charles was sure that with a little more work, she would be able to take a few steps on her hind feet. Charles had a feeling that if David really did have a cousin in the circus, he would adopt Sweetie in a minute. And if David's cousin didn't exist, even Sammy still had to agree circus with Sweetie was the best game ever. Maybe even better than Base Booja. Chapter 6. Every day after school that week, Mom drove Sammy and Charles and Sweetie over to David's. Every day she said the same thing to David. Mother, are you sure it's okay? And explained again about how poor Buddy was having a hard time adjusting to life with Sweetie. Every day, David's mother said that it was fine and that the boys were welcome as long as they didn't bother the cat. She promised to check in often to make sure the boys weren't rough housing too much down there. And every day, Charles and Sammy and David and Sweetie played circus. They were getting ready really good. Sweetie was practically ready to join a real circus. Charles had not told anyone in his family yet, but he was pretty sure that David's cousin would end up adopting Sweetie. When they found out, everybody would be so happy, especially Buddy. He was getting a little better about having Sweetie around, but he still barked if he saw her perched up on Charles' lap and sulked if he saw Lizzie pet her. The circus game started the same way every day. Ladies and gentle pups. Sammy announced he had made a ringmaster tall top hat out of a black construction paper and a megaphone out of a red. Welcome to the Sam Charda Circus. He made that name up by combining their names. Charles did not think it was the best circus name ever, but he kept that to himself. For your entertainment, we present this evening for our star performer. That delightful dog, that perfect puppy, that completely clever cannon, Sweetie the Poodle. Charles walked out into the middle of the mat-covered floor, with Sweetie trotting next to him on a red leash. Take a bow, Lizzie, he said as he bowed down himself, and Sweetie copied him. She stuck her two front paws and stretched in a doggy play pose to take a bow. Just by saying those words whenever he stretched that way and then giving him a treat for a reward, soon Buddy learned to bow whenever he heard the command. So Charles had taught Sweetie too. It was the perfect trick for a circus dog. Every time she did it, the crowd, Charles, David, and Sammy went wild. Then the tricks began. Sweetie could already shake hands, bark and command, sit up pretty, and even take 3 or 4 steps on her hind feet. Charles ran through all her tricks with her, and then moved on to the really flashy stuff. Sweetie was getting better and better at jumping through the hoop. even if he held it up really high. Charles could tell that Sweetie loved every minute of it. She loved doing the tricks. She loved the attention for the applause, and she loved the treats and the kisses and hugs she got every time she did something special. She was so happy that sometimes she just dashed around in wild circles with her eyes shining and her fluffy ears flapping wildly. She barked and wagged her tail and barked some more. This is the most fun I've ever had. I was born to be a performer. Boys, David's mom down the stairs to check on them. Try not to get Sweetie overexcited. Slinky can hear the barking, and it makes her nervous. She gave David a look. Hope you boys aren't up to anything dangerous, she said. All three boys shook their heads. What could be dangerous about playing circus? On Thursday afternoon, David mentioned that his cousins would be arriving in a few days. He need a really special trick to knock his socks off, said Sammy. They all thought for a few minutes. Got it, David snapped his fingers. Let's make a human pyramid. Charles didn't know what that meant until David explained. We used to do that at my camp last summer. You guys get on your hands and knees next to each other. Then I climb up so that one of my hands and one of my knees is on each of your backs. Why do you get to be on top? Sammy asked. I'm the littlest, David said. Sammy and Charles looked at each other and shrugged. Okay, said Charles, even though he wondered if this might be what David's mother called roughhousing. Come on, Salami. He dropped his hands to his knees. Sammy did the same, right next to Charles. Then David climbed on top. David's bony knee dug into Charles' back. But when Charles raised his head to glance in the mirror, he could not believe how totally cool that looked. Now let's see if Sweetie will climb up on top of me, David said. I don't know, Charles began, but David was already calling the puppy. Sweetie, up, he said. Sweetie ran over and jumped, and Charles felt her step lightly on his back for just a moment before she scrambled up onto David's. Whoa! Sammy checked the mirror. This is the best trick yet. This rocks, David agreed. Except my back is killing me. I can't hold you up anymore. Charles groaned and sank onto his belly. His face was squashed into the plastic-smelling mat. David tumbled onto the mat, laughing, and Sweetie sprang off and landed as lightly as a leaf. A second later, she licked Charles' face. What's up? Wake up, sleepyhead! The pyramid was the coolest circus trick yet. They practiced it over and over. Charles put on a thick sweatshirt so that David's knees wouldn't stick into him so badly. Sammy made up a whole speech about the amazing one-of-a-kind, never-before-seen human pyramid. Topped by a poodle. And David kept coming up with ideas to make the pyramid better and better. They were trying one out with David standing on their backs, one foot on Charles and one foot on Sammy. He had just called Sweetie to see if she would jump into his arms when the door at the top of the stairs popped open. It's a little too quiet down there, David's mother started. down the stairs, a dish towel in her hands. "What are you boys up to?" But before she made it down far enough to see them, something else happened. Charles saw a flash of brown on the stairs near her feet. He heard a startled yowl. "Slinky!" The cat's curiosity off toward the stairs, chasing madly after terrified cat. "Whoa!" David cried as he lost his balance. He fell backward and Charles heard a dull clunk. When Charles jumped up and turned around, he saw David lying on the floor near the treadmill, holding his head in his hands. "Ow!" wailed David as his mother rushed down the few steps. "Are you okay, honey?" she cried. David reached out for her. "Mom!" Then Charles saw the blood. Chapter 7. David's mom knelt at his side and held the dish towel to his bleeding head. Sammy knelt too and patted David's shoulder. Charles stared at them. He felt as if he'd been frozen in a block of ice, like he couldn't move his hands or feet. Wasn't there something he could do? David moaned. "Charles, go upstairs and call 911. Said David's mother. Of course, he should have thought of that before. He forgot about being frozen and dashed up the stairs. He started up, taking them two at a time. "Take it slow, Charles," called David's mother. "We don't need another accident." Charles slowed down a teensy bit. Upstairs, he ran to the kitchen phone. Way back when he was the Bean's age, his dad had taught Charles about calling 911. Dad had always told him that for real, true emergencies, when you needed help, fast dialing 911 was the best way to call the police or firefighters or ambulance. He knew that you should never call 911 just for fun or as an experiment to see what would happen. But this was definitely an emergency. So for the very first time, Charles was about to punch those numbers into the telephone. He took a deep breath to calm himself down the way Dad had taught him. He got ready to listen because he knew that the dispatcher, the person who answered the phone, would have some questions for him. Then he punched in the three numbers. 911. Later, it was hard to remember everything he had said. He knew he had told the dispatcher that there had been an accident, that his friend had hit his head on something. He knew he had told David's address. That was easy to remember because he rhymed 42 Meadowview and phone number. By the time he'd answered her questions, she told him that help was already on its way. Sure enough, only a few moments after he hung up, he heard a siren coming closer. Charles ran to the front door so he could wave to the ambulance and let them know they were at the right house. His heart pounded. The ambulance pulled up in front of the house, and three people in blue jumpsuits piled out. Charles knew all of them. They were firefighters from his dad's stations. Like his dad, they didn't just fight fires. They were also emergency EMT, emergency medical technicians who were trained to take care of medical emergencies. If Dad had been on duty that afternoon, he might have been there too. Charles, Meg Parker, was the first one up to the porch steps. "Are you okay?" Charles nodded. "I'm fine, but my friend David fell and hit his head." "Show me where he is." Meg was all business. The two other EMTs, Andy and Scott, ran up. Andy had a big orange duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and Scott carried what looked like a long blue surfboard. Charles led them all down to the basement, and without any extra talking, they knelt around Charles and began to check him out. "That was fast," Sammy whispered to Charles. He cradled Sweetie in his arms, and his face was pale. Even Sweetie seemed to know that something serious was going on. She didn't wriggle or struggle, and when Sammy handed her to Charles, she just quietly licked his face and then settled down in his arms. Charles took her leash out of his pocket and clipped it onto her collar. Just in case they did not need a poodle puppy running around, David's mom stood and watched the EMTs. Her face was even wider than Sammy's. Finally, Meg rose to her feet. "David is going to be just fine," she said. "He's got a nasty cut that may need some stitches, and since he did hit his head, we'll move him carefully. We'll just use the backboard to carry him up the stairs." She gestured to Scott, who laid the surfboard down next to David. Charles inched a little closer so he could watch the EMTs work fast and bandaged the top of David's head in a white gauze and strapped him to the board. At one point, he opened his eyes and looked straight at Charles. David did not look scared. In fact, he even gave Charles a little smile. "Take care, Sweetie," he said. "I will." Charles gave Sweetie a kiss on the head as he and Sammy watched the EMTs carry David up the stairs. David's mother followed close behind. Suddenly, Charles thought of something. David was on his way to the hospital, and his mom would go too, which would leave Sammy and Charles alone at the house. "Maybe I should call my mom to come get us," he said to Sammy. But when they got upstairs, there was Charles' dad, already talking to Meg. He ran over to Charles, knelt down, and gave him a big, strong bear hug. "David's gonna be fine," he whispered into Charles' ear. "I'm so glad you're safe. When my beeper went off and I heard there was an ambulance on its way to this address," he stopped and shook his head. "I'm just glad everyone's okay." The EMTs put David into the back of the ambulance and drove off with their lights flashing. David's mom followed in her car. Charles and his dad and Sammy just stood there for a moment without talking. Charles realized that his legs felt shaky. Then he realized something else. Sweetie wanted to get down and run around. She gave a little bark and began to wriggle Charles' arms. He put her down on the ground. You were a very, very good girl," he said. "You did pretty well yourself." Dad ruffled Charles' hair. "I'm proud of you." Later, when Mom heard the whole story, she was proud too. But at dinner that night, she also was careful. "This is exactly why I was worried about you boys getting too wild," she said. "You can be having fun one minute, and the next minute somebody can wind up." Luckily, just then the phone rang. It was David's mother. "Everything is okay," she told Charles. David has some stitches in his head, so he looks like Frankenstein's monster, and they want to keep him at the hospital overnight, just to keep an eye on him. But he feels fine. I'm going to pick him up in the morning, and I thought you and Sammy might like to come along." "Definitely," said Charles. "That would be great." And David's mother's voice grew softer. "Thanks, you really helped out." Chapter 8. Maybe we should forget about the circus game and get back to Booja Ball. David smiled weakly. "It's safer." It was the next morning, and Sammy and Charles stood near the bed in David's hospital room while his mom talked to a nurse just outside the door. Charles shifted from foot to foot, feeling uncomfortable. It was weird to see David lying there with a big white bandage on his head. Charles was half disappointed and half relieved that he could not see David's stitches. He wasn't sure what to say or how to act. He had not spent a lot of time in hospitals before. He looked at Sammy. Maybe Sammy would think of something to say. Sammy started down at the floor. "Booja Ball sounds good," said Charles. I'm sorry you got hurt." "It's not your fault," David said. "I'm the one who came up with the whole crazy idea to stand up on your backs." He grinned anyway. "I'm fine. I'm just happy I get to go home. The food here is terrible." He pointed at a tray on the table next to his bed. "They call that French toast." Sammy perked up. "French toast? You can have it if you want," said David. "I couldn't eat it." Sammy went over and started to poke at the leftover breakfast. Charles shook his head. Sammy would eat anything. David's mom came into the room, ready to go home. She ruffled David's hair. "As soon as the nurse says you're free to leave, we'll get out of here." "All right," said David. There was a knock at the door. "Hello?" A smiling redhead woman with a freckled nose leaned into the room. She gave a little wave. "It looks as if you already have visitors. Want another?" She gave to a big curly-haired brown dog who stood next to her. "I'm Jamie, and this is Tate. He's a therapy dog, and he loves to visit people in the hospital." Charles recognized Jamie right away. She was the puppy kindergarten teacher he had met her when he and Lizzie had taken Rascal, a wild little puppy that they had fostered to her class. Jamie was a great dog trainer, patient and caring, and always ready to crack a joke. "Cool," said David. "Come on, Tate. In, Tate." Tate trotted right into the room and headed straight for David's bed. He put his front paws up on the bed very gently, and David patted him. "He'll give you a kiss if you ask for one," Jamie said. She smiled encouragingly at David. "How about a kiss, Tate?" asked David. Tate leaned forward and nuzzled David's cheek. He looked huge compared to Sweetie. Charles couldn't believe there was a dog in the hospital. Lizzie had told him about therapy dogs who were trained to visit people in hospitals and nursing homes, but he had never met one before. "Can we pet Tate?" he asked Jamie. Jamie turned to look at him. "Hey, I know you, Charles, right? Your family foster puppies. You brought one to me to my puppy kindergarten class." She grinned and shook her head. "Rascal, that Jack Russell Terrier. was one of the few dogs I have ever had to kick out of class. But I know you found him a great home anyway. She gestured of Tate. Of course you can pet him. Tate loved attention. Charles and Sammy went over and knelt down by Tate. His fur was curly and soft, and he held perfectly still while they petted him. Then he put out of his big paw for a shake. He's so good, Charles said. Tate is... Guys, I'm going to get some water. Tate is the best, Jamie said proudly. Charles could tell how much he loved dogs. That's partly his personality, and partly his training. Therapy dogs have to be friendly, but not too friendly. We don't want them to jump on sick people or kiss people who don't like dogs. They have to have good manners too. Tate is perfect for the job. What's the idea behind therapy dogs? Asked David's mother. She came over to pet Tate. Having a dog come to visit can really lift some people's spirits. If they were lonely or sad in the hospital, Jamie said dogs love everyone, whether they are sick or well, old or young, and most people are happy to be around dogs. A visit gives people something to look forward to. You should give the smiles. When Tate and I go to the nursing home, he reminds a lot of older people of the dogs they used to have. Plus, he gives people something to think about besides being sick or lonely or hurting. Does Tate have special training? David's mom asked. Oh, yes, said Jamie. Besides all the manners I've taught him and the tricks he knows, he also had to learn about to behave on visits and pass a special test before he became a certified therapy dog. Training Tate to be a therapy dog was one of the most challenging and enjoyable things I've ever done. Charles fingered the tag on Tate's collar. That said therapy dog. What kind of dog is Tate? Said Sammy. He's a mutt, a mixed breed. I think he has some poodle in him. That would explain the curly hair and why he's so smart. We know a miniature poodle puppy who's really smart, said David. She can do a ton of tricks, and she makes everybody smile. She could probably become a good therapy dog when she grows up. Jamie chuckled, her tongue. Tate, can you show us some tricks? Tate could sit, shake hands, roll over, and sit up pretty, but his best tricks was when Jamie pretended to sneeze with a big achoo. Tate trotted over to his tissue box, pulled out a tissue with his teeth, and brought it to her. David and Sammy and Charles liked that trick so much that they all had to have a turn pretending to sneeze so that Tate could bring them a tissue. Just as Jamie was showing them how Tate could play dead, a nurse came. You're all set, David. You can head home anytime. Charles was surprised. He had so much fun watching Tate that he had almost forgotten he was in the hospital. Maybe that was what therapy dogs were all about. They each gave Tate a hug and said goodbye to him. and Jamie. Then Charles and Sammy waited out in the hall while David got dressed and ready to go. "I've got a big surprise for you," David's mom told him on the way home. "Ducky's coming tomorrow." "Tomorrow? I thought he's coming until next week," David said. "He wasn't until he heard about your accident. He said he figured you could use some cheering up." "Cool," David grinned. "I hope he remembers not to wear his costume." His mom laughed. "What costume?" Charles asked. "His clown outfit," said David. "I didn't tell you. Ducky's his clown, but he never wears his costume when he visits because my dad," he laughed. "Well, believe it or not, my dad thinks clowns are scary." Charles looked at Sammy. Sammy looked back at Charles. Sammy was the only person in the whole world who knew Charles' secret. He too was afraid of clowns. Chapter 9. So guys, we are going to end that video right here. So, happy day.